Freddy versus Jason movie review. Yeah, actually, before getting around to reviewing this movie, I'm going to go off on a brief digression, which is kind of my theory of horror movies. So, as a kid, I was fascinated by horror movies. As a lot of kids are. By kid, I mean kind of around, I don't know, from 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, those ages. 15, 16, maybe 17, 18 perhaps. Every once in a while, I would, kind of, as you do, try and psychoanalyze myself and think, why am I so interested in this? Which is an interesting question. Although, it's one of those things, if you pull at that thread long enough, why are we interested in anything, right? Like, I mean, it's an interesting question. Why do human beings like horror movies so much? What is it about the horror genre that appeals to us? But then, what is it about any genre that appeals to us? Why do we like comedy? Or where does humor come from? Or why do we like adventure stories? Or why do we like fantasy? Like, why do we like stories about weird monsters? Or why do we like science fiction? Or why do people like obsessing over long-running series and continuity and world building? Who knows, right? But yeah, interesting question. Why do we like horror movies? But yeah, I was fascinated by this as a kid, and I largely was not allowed to watch it. My parents were quite restrictive about my viewing. Of course, everybody knows, if you've ever been to like summer camp or like school, there are always some kids whose parents will let them watch anything. And they always have kind of seen all the horror movies, and they've known everything, and so they're at the playground telling the story about these horror movies to all the other kids. So like I heard about it vicariously through the other kids. And then as I grew older, I kind of argued my mom down more and more, and I was allowed to see some stuff. I was allowed, at a certain point around 12 or something, I was allowed to see like the old horror movies, which actually I was fine with. I mean, I would have loved to see the new horror movies as well. But I was also a big classic film buff, even at a young age. So I was very curious to see the old Frankenstein and the old Dracula. And I still have a very fond place in my heart for all those Universal monster movies. And I saw them all eventually. Pretty much all of them. I think The Ghost of Frankenstein is the only one I never saw of like the big three, the Frankenstein, Wolfman, and Dracula movies. I'll save those for another day. That's kind of a different subject for a different day. And then eventually, once I got old enough to kind of, move out of home and live on my own, or live in the college dormitories at least, we did watch some of the old kind of Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and I found them quite disappointing by the time I finally got around to watching them. These movies had loomed in my imagination so much as a kid. I mean, I wasn't allowed to see them. But, you pick them up through pop culture, you see the advertisements, other kids are talking about them. And I just assumed they would be terrifying. And then I was disappointed to find out that, yeah, I mean, it was all right, but it wasn't really that scary. And this is what I call kind of the paradox of horror movies, is when you're at the age where these would actually terrify you, you're too young to see them. By the time you're 18 and you're old enough to kind of see whatever you want to see, these movies no longer scare you anymore. The other weird thing I've noticed as I've gotten older and older is I'm at the age now where I've kind of completely lost interest in them, which is something I didn't really see coming as a kid. I mean, as a kid, I kind of thought, these are like adult movies, this is stuff made for adults. But you get to a certain age and you just kind of lose interest in horror movies. And I'm not sure why that is exactly. I mean, this gets back to the question of why are horror movies so fascinating for kids to begin with. I've thought about this a little bit, and I do have kind of a couple ideas off the top of my head. Kind of one idea is, I think when you're a kid, when you're young, the illusion that the movie world is real on its own terms is much stronger. So kids don't actually think movies are real. I mean, once they're past the age of 5 or whatever. They know that movies aren't real. But when you watch a movie as a kid, you have this illusion that it's real on its own terms, if that makes sense. For example, when I watch a movie now, and like a character dies, I think to myself, okay, the screenwriters needed to kill off that character to add some depth to the second act low point. Or they needed to kill off this character for a cheap thrill, or this is part of the character. You know, like as an adult, you see behind the curtain a bit more. And you're not like, this is a real character that died. You're like, this is something that the screenwriters did to kind of add to the tension. But when you're a kid, the illusion that, even though you know the movie's not real, that the story seems a lot more genuine. So like when you're watching a movie as a kid and a character dies, you feel like somebody actually died. I mean, you know it's all a story, but you feel like there's this story world where this is all kind of true on its own terms. And I think that's part of what makes horror movies much more horrifying for a kid. Is as an adult, you're just like, okay, that's just an actor and makeup, and this is just kind of a cheap thing the screenwriters are doing. Whereas a kid, even though you know on an intellectual level that it is just an actor and makeup, you just get so sucked into the story that you forget that. I don't know. The point of all this, the point of this long digression, is I realized something which in retrospect is obvious, but this was a relatively new realization to me, is that these movies are not aimed at adults. As a kid, I always thought they were aimed as adults because they were rated R and you couldn't get in to see them unless you were 17 or whatever. But the filmmakers here are playing this old game, like they know that kids are not allowed to see these movies, but they also know that kids will see these movies anyways. They'll sneak in, or like some parent will let them come in, or like they'll go to a friend's house and watch them. They're playing this little game here. So even though they're rated R and you have to be 17 or whatever, the filmmakers know full well that their target audience for these movies is 11 and 12-year-olds, because those are the people who are really scared by this kind of thing, or who really get thrilled by this kind of thing. Which brings me to Freddy versus Jason, which I'm sure would have been a great film if I had been 12 years old again. But watching it now, it's just kind of stupid. But mildly entertaining, kills off a few brain cells, a couple hours where I don't have to really think too deeply. So I enjoyed it more or less. I get the sense that the film is kind of making fun of itself, that it's a self-parody. Now, at this point, there was a point in the 90s when these kind of parodies of slasher movies started coming out, like the Scream trilogy and all the scary movies, which were kind of a parody of the Scream trilogy and kind of a parody of other scary movies. So at this point, to kind of even mention the cliches of a slasher movie is almost kind of a cliche itself. because like so many other people have pointed it out. In this movie, Freddy vs. Jason seems to just kind of embrace all these cliches, and I expect they're doing it somewhat tongue-in-cheek. So you have the flat teenage characters, the kind of characters who have no personality, and their only purpose is to just get cut up by the slashers. You have this weirdly bizarre thing which goes on in American horror movies, where characters who have premarital teenage sex or use illegal drugs are always like the first to die, which I know tons of other people have commented on that cliche. It's this weird conservative moral thing which seems to have seeped into kind of American horror movies. But yeah, that's in this movie as well. I think they're doing it tongue-in-cheek. You have characters doing stupid things like wandering off alone, going into rooms that they know they shouldn't go into, that they should know they shouldn't go into. Yeah. And then, to top it all off, the ultimate stupidity, after there's a stream of killings in a small town, what do the local teenagers decide to do? They hold a rave out in the cornfield. And then tons of them go off and wander around alone out in these rows of corn while this killing spree is going on. So, I don't know, either this is just really lazy writing, or I suspect it's kind of intentional self-parody. But at this point, we've already had so many parodies of the slasher genre that what is this adding, really? I don't know. Of course, the big selling point of this is that it combines the two horror giants from my childhood, from the 1980s, even though I was never allowed to see them in the 1980s, but Freddy and Jason. And it is moderately entertaining to watch them face off against each other. Although it's abundantly clear at this point that neither one of them can be killed. I mean, I don't know how many times each of them has died and resurrected by this point, but it's got to be like, I don't know, like 15 times for Jason and 7 times for Freddy. So it's a little bit pointless to just kind of watch them cut each other up because, I don't know, what's the point? But at the very least, having both of them in this film and having them face off against each other saves it from just being an ordinary slasher film. And you've got a few different balls being juggled in the air. You have both the normal storyline of the teenagers trying to survive, and you have the story of Jason fighting Freddy. So between the two of it, there's enough going on to at least keep the film interesting for 2 hours, or however long this is. But like most crossover films, Freddy vs. Jason, Alien vs. Predator, whatever, the script is a bit unimaginative, and you can't help but feel that the whole thing was a bit of a wasted opportunity.